My name is Amanda Lewis. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, or IRRPP, here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We are one of the co-sponsors of today's event. I want to thank you for joining us for Making the Grade: How School Funding Impacts Educational Equity in Illinois. Today we'll discuss questions of educational funding across the country and particularly in the state of Illinois. And we'll explore some of the tensions between the progress that our state has made in increasing educational equity through the evidence-based funding formula, along with the really important continuing work we need to do related to inequitable funding distributions. The main focus of this event is the latest Making the Grade report by the good folks at the Educational Law Center, which assesses the relationship between funding and educational equity across the country. It also builds on the partnership, the work of the Partnership for Equity and Educational Rights Coalition, or PEER Illinois, of which IRRPP is a part, and our concern with the relationship between school funding and equitable education for all students across the state. This concern was also central to a recent report that IRRPP did on education, which I'll bring in later in the discussion as we talk through some of the key issues. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording this event and we'll post it on our website at irrpp.uic.edu, and all these links will be in the chat. We are using Zoom's version of live transcription to caption the event. Although it is getting better, it is still not the best, and we apologize in advance for any mistakes. For those that are interested in accessibility to the information today in a language other than English, you can change the language option by clicking the little up arrow icon next to the Show Captions button. And there, under Captions and Translation, you can enable translation and then select the language that you want to see it in. If you're having challenges with this, put something in the Q&A and our folks can try to help you. But don't forget to click save after you select which language you want. The format for today is that our two wonderful panelists will do short presentations, and then we will go into a group discussion. We will share links and information via the chat along the way, but the chat is the main vehicle for us to share information with you. But we do want to hear your questions, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to post questions along the way, and we'll be accumulating those and going to them afterwards. And with that, let me introduce our panelists for today. Danielle Ferry is a research director at the Educational Law Center, or ELC. She conducts analysis to support litigation and public policy for ELC and partner organizations. Danielle has authored book chapters and peer-reviewed articles on topics such as school finance and school segregation. She has testified about school funding issues before numerous state and national commissions and has provided expert testimony in state school funding lawsuits. She holds a PhD in sociology from Temple University. And then we have Beatriz Diaz-Polak, a lawyer and director of educational equity at the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Beatriz works to address educational disparities in our public school systems and advocate for secure access to a high-quality education for all students. She brings experience working on issues related to the educational system, from multiple perspectives, including most recently as an Illinois Special Education Due Process Hearing Officer, as a researcher and consultant examining legal issues impacting the education of multilingual learners, and as an educator at both the elementary school and university levels. She has a JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School. All right, so now I'm going to welcome Danielle and turn it over to her. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for having me today. Make sure, or I'll get started. Oh, there they are. The slides are there. So thank you for having me. I am going to take pretty much a 10,000-foot view to try and answer the question, how fair is school funding in Illinois? So as Amanda said, I'm going to be presenting findings from ELC's annual report on the condition of school funding in the states, Making the Grade. which we publish every year in hopes of having conversations just like this. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that national reports like this, sort of by design, lack the nuance about the specific context within each state. So a national report on a topic that's as complicated as and complex as school funding can be is going to lack some of the detail that's required to understand each state's specific context. But we do have to start the conversation somewhere. So this is what I'm going to try to do today, and I know that the other panelists are going to fill in all of that very necessary detail. Okay, next slide. So the first question that we should answer is, what is fair school funding? The report is built on the principle that in order to be fair, school funding must be both adequate and equitable. So that means that states have to provide an overall level of funding that's sufficient to provide all students with the resources they need to meet state standards, and that funding should be distributed so that students in poverty receive higher funding levels. It also means that the state is fairly funding their schools if they're making a reasonable effort to raise the revenue that's required to meet conditions 1 and 2. Next slide. So in order to, I think go back one. There we go. So in order to evaluate a state's fairness, we construct 3 measures of funding fairness: level, distribution, and effort. We use federal data to construct these indicators, mainly from district level school finance survey that's collected by the US Census. And we also use federal poverty estimates, again, constructed by the census. The data that's in the most recent report reflects the 22-23 school year, which is the most recent data that's available. Another caveat about these measures is that they're comparative in nature. So we're ranking states and grading them on a normal curve. And that means that the highest performing states are going to get A's and the lowest performing states are going to get F's. We don't have any benchmarks that we are evaluating states against. So that means that a state that gets an A or a B still may have room for improvement. All the grade is showing us is whether they're doing better or worse than the other states. Okay, next slide. Great. Our first measure is funding level. So that's how much each state allocates in state and local revenue per pupil. We do not include federal revenue. We're focused on state and local because that is really sort of the lever for policy change when we're talking about school funding. We do adjust these per pupil levels for differences in regional costs so that we're making meaningful comparisons across states that have very different costs of living. Illinois does well on this measure, getting an A by spending about $4,000 more than the national average. And again, even though the average funding level is higher than the national average, this doesn't mean that it's necessarily enough. Each state should be determining how much funding is necessary for students to meet their own unique educational standards, and that is not something that we have a national benchmark for. So what we're seeing here is simply that Illinois is a comparatively high spending state. So this is a dramatic improvement over the 15 period that we have been publishing data for. Illinois was getting a D on this measure and spending well below average in the first years of our analysis. The chart on the top right here shows the difference in the inflation-adjusted per pupil spending between Illinois, which is in blue, and the national average, which is in gray. So it might be a little bit hard to see, but Illinois was spending below the national average until about 2011, and then funding levels started to rise in Illinois faster than they were in other states. So it sort of moved up and then became one of the higher spending states. In the bottom, actually, if you go back, the bottom graphs show that even though the state is still heavily reliant on local revenue, an increase in state aid is responsible for much of this funding boost. Again, probably hard to see, but the chart shows that local revenue on the left increased by about 56% between 2008 and 2023. Well, on the left, state revenue has more than doubled over this time period. So this is a little bit opposite of what we see in most states, where we see local revenue going faster than the state, but Illinois is one of the places where there has been a very significant investment in state revenue in recent years. Okay, next. So effort is our next measure, and it's measured as state and local education revenue as a percentage of each state's GDP. So this is what we call the state's effort. Along with its fiscal capacity, that is what determines how much funding schools have. So this measure tells us whether states are making more or less effort compared to other states, and then we can also gauge whether the state's effort has changed over time. So Illinois does well here. It gets an A on this measure and is ranked 4th among all 50 states. We find that even with a higher than average fiscal capacity, basically saying that Illinois has a very healthy economy compared to many states, even with that high level of economic productivity, Illinois directs a larger than average amount of that economic activity into its school system through both state and local taxes. So in contrast to wider national trends, Illinois has actually increased its effort over the last 15 years. Just like I was saying previously with the funding level, revenue for schools has grown at about the same pace as the state's economy, while in most of the country, investments in the public school system have actually lagged far behind economic growth, leading to lower overall effort scores. So again, does that mean that Illinois is doing enough? Absolutely not. Just because a state is doing better than most other states, that doesn't mean that it's meeting the needs of its students. And in Illinois, the underfunding of the EBF formula clearly indicates that the state isn't even living up to its own obligation to provide state funds for its schools. So even with that caveat, you may be thinking that I'm presenting a pretty rosy picture of school funding in your state, and which may be counter to the way that you experience things, but I did save the worst measure for last. So the final measure is funding distribution. So this is basically our equity measure. So it compares the average funding levels between the highest and lowest poverty districts within a state, while controlling for other cross drivers. The methods are a little bit more complex than I'm presenting here, but you can read, if you're interested, you can read the report and the technical appendix for more detail. But what we do is categorize states as either progressive, which are the blue states on this map here, regressive, yellow states, or flat, which are the gray states. So the progressive states allocate more funding to high poverty districts compared to low poverty districts, and the regressive states allocate less to high poverty districts. So Illinois is sort of in the middle. It's a flat state, where the highest poverty districts on average get about 4% or about $900 less per pupil than the lowest poverty districts. So Illinois is one of the lower ranked states in this regard, ranking 35th and getting a D on this measure. Underneath these averages, we see enormous variations in funding, even among districts with similar poverty rates. So what we see in Illinois is that funding levels vary greatly from district to district, but that variation is not closely related to student poverty, which is what we are looking for. So we do want funding to vary by student poverty. We want districts that have higher poverty levels to systematically get higher funding levels, but that is not happening in Illinois. To put this in context of the high grades on the other two measures, what this means is that, oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. What this means is that even though Illinois is spending a lot and makes a high effort to fund its schools, at least relative to other states, it does not distribute that funding equitably. So high poverty districts are not typically getting more funding than low poverty districts to account for all of those increasing costs of educating students in poverty. And in some of the states, high average spending is driven by well-funded districts that often drastically outspend states' poorer districts. Next slide. Okay, so the news here is not all bad. The state is moving in the right direction. Illinois had been among the most regressive states, spending about 70 cents in a typical high poverty district for every dollar spent in a typical low poverty district. That has significantly improved. So now that disparity is only 96 cents to the dollar. So hopefully continued investment in EBF will improve that even further. Okay, next slide. So finally, I just want to point out that Illinois is far from alone in having a well-funded but inequitable school funding system. Some other states, all of them in the Northeast or the Midwest, also get A's in funding level and D's or F's in distribution. All of these states need to do more to make sure that the funding that's raised for schools goes to the places where it needs it, where they need it most, rather than allowing a system where, typically high reliance on local property taxes and inadequate state revenue drive what we would call regressive spending inequities. Next slide. So you can find most of the charts that I shared today on these slides in our state profiles that are available on our website. And obviously you can dive deeper into the report to get a little bit more background. I'm always happy to have deeper conversations. If anyone does want to discuss the report in more detail, I'm happy to do that. But I think that is it for me, and I'll turn it over to our other panelists.
Thanks so much, Danielle. I really appreciate year over year learning a lot from the report, but also from your willingness to share additional perspective and be in dialogue with us as state-based folks on these issues. So thank you for sharing today. As Amanda said earlier, my name is Beatrice Diaz-Pollock. I'm here presenting on behalf of our Peer Illinois Coalition. We can go to the next slide. Peer Illinois is a statewide coalition organizing and advocating for full and fair resourcing of our public schools and to ensure that all Illinois students, regardless of race, family, income, or their neighborhood, have access to an excellent and fully funded education. The coalition brings together grassroots organizations, researchers, and advocacy partners from across the state. We have partners as far north as Rockford and as far south as East St. Louis, and as part of a national network of education justice coalitions. And thank you. We at Peer Illinois have been engaging in learning alongside with school communities and parents on the issues impacting school funding, and especially on these issues related to the equity in our funding system for the last many years. And as Danielle already began to reference, one of the main issues that we see prevalent here in Illinois is that despite what is considered a progressive school funding formula called the evidence-based funding formula, which is a primary mechanism through which state dollars are flowed through to school districts, we still see, most likely related to EBF's vast underfunding, that there is a high degree of inequity in how our systems are funded. And EBF was intended, in fact, to address this issue of inequity in our funding system. So that last funding measure that Danielle spoke to, the D that we're receiving in equity, is really something that we're continuing to concentrate our research and advocacy around, and in trying to drive additional urgency in how our state funds our educational system, because these are exactly the students in school districts that EBF was intended to provide a greatest benefit to, and the data show us that we're not there yet. The formula was passed in 2017, and the General Assembly set a target of 2027 for fully funding the formula itself. This is what Danielle referred to as the state determining what it finds to be necessary to fund its educational system. We call this adequacy or adequacy targets. And now, as lawmakers are working on the creation of our fiscal year 2027 budget, our research tells us that EBF is still underfunded by about $5.7 billion, meaning that at current rates of investment and financial projections, it'll be closer to 2045 before we reach the 100% of adequacy laid out for all districts in the law. And of course, because our state still relies heavily on property taxes, as Danielle also referenced, to fund our local systems, districts with lower poverty wealth have to tend to feel the impacts of the underfunding of EBF more sharply. And given history of redlining and other race-based housing discrimination practices, past and present, this dynamic also yields racialized outcomes in our school funding. So with all this in mind, Pure Illinois set out to create another avenue to investigate school funding data in our state. And we produced this evidence-based funding data tool that you see on your screen. And we can also drop a link in the chat shortly. In a moment, I'll walk through the intent and functionality of the tool, but again, I'll also invite you to visit it at the link in the chat. So the tool relies on publicly available data sources that you can see in the About tab that is linked there. And then you'll also see that we've aggregated here financial data around statewide adequacy. And also, this is expressed in terms of per pupil percentages, which even though we know we don't have a per pupil funding formula, is one of the ways that we make concrete our understanding of how funding is playing out in school districts and school buildings across the state. And the tool also provides a dollars to desk staffing calculation, which we consider one concrete metric of how current funding levels are impacting school districts. This relies on ISB, Illinois State Board of Education compiled data, and calculates what additional funding could mean by correlating reported staffing levels from school districts with adequacy data. In addition, the tool allows you to explore the sources of revenue for your school district and student demographics for the school district. Really important to note, and we'll go through a couple examples in just a moment, but despite the efforts put into the weighted funding formula in Illinois, the funds are not restricted. We're a local control state, so this means that calculations are conducted at the State Board of Education level in order to reach those adequacy targets annually. But once the funds do flow to school districts locally make their allocation decisions. So even with these calculations, these represent estimates of what would be possible, but they require a significant amount of analysis, investigation, and advocacy at school district level in order to drive how the EBF resources are allocated once they hit a school district. To illustrate an example of this, as I said, we'll look at two districts. We could go to the next slide, please. I selected two districts that are geographically close to each other, and at least one in which we've recently presented to community-based members, and that is Waukegan School District 60. I know the images are very small, so I'll walk you through some of the major data points, but again, the link to the tool is in the chat. So if you wanted to go in there, you can. You'll see where there's a school district drop down, and in there you can begin to type Waukegan, and it'll pull up the data for you. So looking at Waukegan School District 60, the 2026 adequacy target as calculated by ISB, State Board of Education, is approximately $271 million. EBF resources available in that school district are calculated at about $195 million, meaning that there is an existing underfunding of approximately $76 million. Per pupil, this means an underfunding of about $5,000, over $5,000 per student, and yields an adequacy target of about 72%. Here we see, what does this mean? Really, even those of us engaged in this advocacy, it can be difficult, I think, to conceptualize what is being at 72% versus 80% versus 90% or 100% mean for a school district funding. So this is where we have the dollars to desks calculations. So in this case, selecting just one of the kinds of staffing roles for core and specialist teachers, we see that 100% of adequacy in this district could yield over 20 more core and specialist positions per school in the district. To deepen the analysis, we have those two bar graphs at the bottom there, which show the revenue sources for the school district and then also student demographics. For revenue sources, I'm focusing on the first two bars. The evidence-based funding revenues represent 50% of the school district's revenues, and local property taxes 24%. And in the demographics, you'll see this school district is approximately 78% students from low-income families, 81% identifying as Latinx or Latina, 11% as Black, and 3% as white. again, so I've listed here, we're seeing the adequacy, overall, impact on staffing or potential impacts, sources of funding, and demographics. Looking to their neighboring district on the next slide. So for those of you who may be familiar with the area, this is all just due north of Chicago, Waukegan a little bit further north than Lake Forest, School District 67, all along Lake Michigan. Lake Forest School District 67 has an adequacy target of about 22 million. This is driven again by the calculation that the State Board of Education conducts annually. Has evidence-based funding final resources calculated at $37 million, which means they have a surplus of about $15 million, or a surplus of about $9,000 per student, yielding a percentage of adequacy of 168%. You'll see in the staffing and core specialists, which is I selected the same metric for the dollars to desks calculation, shows that the data demonstrate adequate staffing for the school district. In the bar graph on revenue sources, you see that 88% of this district's revenues come from local property tax, illustrating some of the dynamics that Danielle also laid out about how highly reliant many districts still are on local revenue. And it also demonstrates the student demographics there, with 1% of students identified as coming from low-income families, 85% as white, 5% as Latina, and 4% as Asian. While these two different examples are distinct, I would say they do not represent outliers. And I think Danielle also noted this. There is vast variability across our state, but they do show what a difference even a few miles can make in the resources available to students in our public schools. And I look forward to having folks also use the tool to explore your own school districts, and also note that there are legislative district tabs there where you can explore by legislative districts the school districts that comprise those legislators' areas, and support conversations with your local electeds if you wish to do that. Thank you for your attention on the tool, and I look forward to having a further discussion with Amanda and Danielle on what these dynamics mean here in Illinois.
I want to start by thanking you both. I think we don't always understand the kind of nuances of educational funding, and particularly the kinds of struggles that have happened historically to try to address the inequities in educational funding. And to that end, I want one of you, whoever feels like it, to weigh in a little bit and talk about, so when we have these conversations, we often talk about adequacy and equity. And that language, if you don't know much about the history of legal fights for educational funding, doesn't always make much sense. Like, why is that the language we're using? So I don't know, Danielle, if you want to start, or Beatrice, one of you, if you could talk a little bit about why that's the language we use and what we mean by the nuances of the difference between those things.
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by saying that while I work at Education Law Center, I am not a lawyer, but I'll do my best to characterize the sort of history of school finance litigation. A lot of the earlier school finance litigation in states was focused on equity and making sure that school districts had relatively equal levels of funding, right? So if there were vast disparities in school districts, mostly related to property wealth because of America's or United States reliance on property taxes, that something needed to be done to disrupt that relationship. More recently, the school funding litigation has focused also not to the exclusion of, but also on adequacy, to say it's not just a matter of making sure that everybody is equally funded, but it's making sure that everybody has the funding that they need in order to, meet standards. So adequacy is going to mean different things in different districts. And that's why we have funding formulas like the EBF formula sort of recognize that district characteristics drive costs And many of those characteristics are based on students. And so students who live in poverty, students who are English learners, students who have special education needs, and like more recent formulas have opened up those characteristics even further to talk about homelessness, foster kids. But all of those put pressure on school district because they come to school needing additional resources. So making sure that a formula is adequate and equitable is really the only way that you could make sure that all students have access to the resources that they need.
Beatrice, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Danielle did a great job of explaining it. I think one of the things we could talk about this for, probably the whole conversation, because there are other also like historical and legal underpinnings to it. But I think rather than take us in that direction, one thing I'll just name is, because they are such terms of art, we also tend to focus our conversation on this issue on the use of the terms of full and fair funding of public schools. That's really, so I'm not equating those 100%. It doesn't, they don't exactly mean adequate and equitable, but I think it offers us a good frame to think about what it is that we're aiming for. And full, as Danielle was getting into, takes into account the students that are being educated in a building and in a district, and what we have learned over, decades of study about what kind of resourcing needs are necessary in order to meet their educational needs, and generate the kinds of outcomes for them that we, agree collectively we're looking for, so that high quality education. And then also, the fairness is around, again, meeting those needs. So that's really, the other piece that I would just name in terms of framing of the issue.
Yeah, I only bring it up because I think it's so important, like, for the state of Illinois, and to think about the context. And Beatrice, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to talk just for a couple minutes about the history of organizing that led to the EBF, because I think it's important for people to recognize that these were like things that were worked for. But part of the reason I also bring it up is because it's helpful for folks to recognize that because educational funding is a state issue, it's not a federal issue for the most part. And because it's supposedly guaranteed in state constitutions, that this fight historically for more equitable funding has happened at the state level. And often the response by states has been to push back. There's a kind of famous case in California, the Williams case, in which, part of what they were fighting for, they were looking at data that said, do your school, what does it mean that the state guarantees education? How similar does it have to be? And they had all this data looking at, did every school have textbooks? Did every school have safe buildings? Did every school have teachers who were teaching in areas where they were certified? All those kinds of things. And the state was arguing for a kind of minimal understanding of what counted as adequate, so that they were not going to be fiscally responsible for actually reaching what you're talking about as full and fair or as equitable. So thinking about these things, even though they're kind of legal terms, also has a big impact on what we think matters. And because I have to say, as the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, because issues of race and racism really have had such a big impact historically on what we think is an adequate or necessary education for different populations. One of the things that we're always interested in is how the explicit policies might have changed, right? So we just published a report on the history of harms to Black Illinoisans, for instance. And there's a very clear and explicit history of trying to deny a full and fair education to Black folks in the state. And that's not true anymore, but it still remains true that we are not providing a full and fair education to all kids in the state. And so trying to think about the historical legacies of those things and how these things carry forward, I think is really interesting. So anyway, but Beatrice, I would love for you to talk for like just a couple minutes about the work that went into constructing the EBF, so that we can think about, as we push for more equitable funding, what kinds of efforts might need to be necessary.
Sure, I appreciate that, Amanda. And before I go into that, I just want to, really acknowledge this piece that you're naming and really connect it back to Danielle's presentation at the outset too. This is why that D in equity, and Danielle named it as well, and is always a great partner in acknowledging, one, the state context matters so much, but also that these are metrics in the report that are by comparisons in nature. And so the fact that Illinois is making these large investments should not, in my mind, overshadow exactly what you're naming, Amanda, which is that when we look at the historical development of these issues, and then that metric around equity is really still something that is incumbent upon us to address, especially with something like the evidence-based funding formula, which is the result of, as you acknowledge, many, many years of work by stakeholders kind of across the spectrum. But in part was intended to really put contours around acknowledgement of some of what you're talking about, of the differences state by state, because it is anchored in constitutions, state constitutions, it is anchored in state statute and policy, what it means for there to be adequate education in that state. So to put those research-based metrics into the formula in a way that acknowledges the costs that are necessary for school districts to meet student need, individual student need. And that is, really the genesis of the 34-factor cost formula that is embedded in EBF, which is what, ends up along with a regionalization cost factor, because there's also an acknowledgement also connected to what you're saying, that in different geographic regions of the state, different regions of the country, it is more costly, more and less costly to be able to provide the resources, whether that looks like teacher salaries, whether that looks like facilities costs, whether that looks like other materials, right? So all of this is embedded into the formula to have an acknowledgement of something that is more grounded in the local school district's actual needs and costs. Mm-hmm. And really, it also was an acknowledgement at the time that the calculations were initially conducted. And I'll have to pull up my other data here in a moment to really look at the underfunding. But there was a very significant underfunding, I believe it's about $8 billion for all districts to reach 100% of adequacy, right? So, and who was disproportionately impacted by that? Students in low-income districts, and by extension, because of all of the factors that you're naming around racist practices around housing patterns and things of that nature, that is inextricably linked to race also across the country, and our state was no different. So there was a lot of advocacy and a lot of organizing around a formula that distributed funds in a way that was responsive to acknowledging and addressing that history of harm. And so that's one other piece that we haven't talked about the formula, which is in addition to the adequacy calculation, once those adequacy calculations are conducted annually, then the districts are sorted into 4 tiers, with the tiers of districts that are furthest from adequacy being those in 1 and 2, and the majority of new state dollars flowing through to those tiers 1 and 2 districts to try and bring them closer to adequacy. This is where we start to see equity. So if you have higher capacity locally to be able to fund schools with, in addition to your base funding that you always received from the state, then also in order to close those gaps, have more of the new state dollars flow to the districts that have the largest gaps. Mm-hmm. That was, really a lot of the organizing and advocacy that was done to begin those, move the system forward in a more equitable manner. So I'm not sure if that's kind of what you were thinking. Happy to answer any follow-up questions, but I think that that's a critical piece of it too. But again, this is where the minimum annual additional investment that the state set out for itself 10 years ago was never going to meet the pace necessary to meet the target of 2027. And that's the moment that we find ourselves in now, right? Like literally in development of a 2027 budget with still a $5.7 billion deficit. And still the districts that were intended to be most advantaged, most benefited by an equitable distribution of our state dollars, the furthest from adequacy, and as a result, that derating.
Anything you want to add to that, Danielle? Before I go to the next.
Yeah, I guess it makes me think too, so this is a typical situation across the country, right? When a state passes a new funding formula and it takes a decade plus for the state to actually live up to its obligation to fund the thing. And then we get into this situation of whether the formula is still accurately reflecting the needs of school districts, right? So I think, I'm not sure to the extent to which this happens in Illinois, but like many states have sort of required review periods. So every 3 years, every 5 years, the components of what builds the formula have to be investigated to make sure that they're still aligned with expectations. And I think, we recently have really seen how much that can impact schools, given COVID, the learning delays, the mental health concerns, that a lot of the frameworks that had been built around what was an adequate funding level for all districts no longer resonates with schools who feel like they have to provide more and more resources. So as advocates are basically struggling just to get the thing funded at the level that the state is obligated to fund it at, the gaps actually are even wider than what it might look like on paper, because the formula hasn't actually kept pace with what school districts really need.
Yeah. And I think that that the example you provided, Beatrice, of Waukegan versus Lake Forest is such an interesting one, because it's both, as you put it, that Waukegan is not adequately funded, but even if it were, Lake Forest and many districts in the state are funded well above the formula for adequacy. And so there's because of the local funding of schools, there's, some of the EBF structure is never going to address that kind of level of inequity. Okay, so
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Amanda, but just one last thing on that. I think one other thing that's embedded in that I think is not like visible to the eye in the way that we set out the data is also the taxation rates in order for a community like Lake Forest to generate that level of local income versus the taxation rates in a higher poverty community. You see inequity as well. So in deeper studies, you can also see, and we take a look at, depending on the average property value, then you can tax your community at a much lower rate and still yield a higher level of revenue than in a community where, for historical and other complex reasons, property values may be artificially depressed or have been depressed over time. You're going to have to tax at a higher rate and still not achieve the kind of levels of revenue that a neighboring district can achieve.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. There's actually an interesting data slide about that in our recent harm report, in part because if you think about the historic legacies of this, there has been a long legacy of particularly Black Illinoisans, because that's what the report is about, not receiving the benefits of their own property taxes. And more recently, as you said, of folks paying more in property taxes, having a higher tax burden, but still getting less than other places. So I think sometimes when you have conversations with folks about this, they'll say, well, districts can, people who value education are gonna, they're like, they have a kind of reading of this about people's investment in education and don't recognize, as you're putting it, that a lot of high poverty districts are in fact taxing at much higher rates, and still they're paying more but getting less, essentially, if we look at the local property tax issue. I want to shift gears here for a moment, and then I'm going to go to, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A that I want to get to, but first I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to talk about the changes going on at the federal level, and particularly with the Department of Education. As we know, educational funding is primarily a local and state matter, but there is some important funding that comes from the state. And Danielle, your report kind of pointed to the fact that even though that funding isn't a large proportion, it does make a big difference for meeting the needs of districts that are inadequately funded in other ways. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that under threat, but also another thing that we're particularly concerned about is the how important that data is, right? We're having a whole conversation here about data and the threat to our being able to even document what's going on in districts because of changes going on at the federal level. So I'll go to Danielle first, and then Beatrice, if you have anything to add, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's funny because as I probably mentioned a little in my presentation, we always frame our report around state and local revenue because, as you said, state states are the ones that determine the structures for how schools are funded. So more than 90% of school funding across the country comes from state and local resources. But when we are all of a sudden thrown into a situation where federal revenue is being threatened at the scale that it had been threatened in the last year, we have to sort of shift our perspective on that. And so what we tried to make the point in the report that federal funding is not a large percentage of revenue, but it does vary by state. And then even more so, it varies by district. So because so much of the federal revenue is allocated based on those student characteristics that are related to either poverty or disability or English learner status, they are generally allocated in a very progressive way. So when we looked at the differences between our funding distribution measure, when we just looked at state and local revenue, and when we added in all federal revenue on top of that, we found that in almost every state, the funding became more progressive. So some regressive states were still regressive, but they were less regressive. But even our most progressive states became more progressive with federal funding. So like the federal funding is the most progressive element of funding in the country right now. And so threats to reduce that funding, which, thankfully have for the moment subsided, and we have a budget for FY26, but we don't know what to expect for FY27 from the federal government. And that is going to impact districts, and it doesn't impact all districts the same, right? So the wealthier districts, like the ones in Illinois that are spending well above adequacy, probably receive very little in federal funds. And so those changes are not going to make a dramatic difference for them. Not no difference, but a smaller impact. And then the higher poverty districts, this places that are serving a lot of English learners, the rural places are going to be the ones that are hit hard if those funding allocations change. On the data issue, I am extremely concerned about what to expect for next year. The census is the one who collects this school district data, but they also rely on the National Center for Education Statistics to do a lot of the data cleaning, to sort of go back and forth with school districts to make sure what they're reporting is accurate. And what we know is that NCES has been decimated. There are not enough people working there. There probably weren't enough people working there before, and now there's even fewer. And so we don't really know. I mean, we know that the survey is in the field. We know that they have sort of preliminary data up, but we still have questions about the quality of that data and how long they can sort of sustain these data collections on such a skeletal staff.
Beatrice, anything you want to add?
Just to add a little bit to what Danielle mentioned with regard to the impact and the disproportionate impact of projected or feared changes in terms of federal funding, federal education funding that's available, is not only are they disproportional, but they tend to be exponential when you talk to folks about what is happening on the ground. Because to tie it back to EBF, one of the important things about EBF and one of the ways that we describe it to school communities is EBF is really intended to lay a firm foundation for our public school systems. So the further that you are from adequacy, the more instability, cracks, holes in your foundation. And then funds as they come in, additional funds as they come in, and though many of the federal grant funds do have more restricted allocation than obviously than the EBF funds, which as I noted are unrestricted when school districts are budgeting them. Still, these things are coming in to plug gaps and holes that exist because we have those foundations that are not structurally sound because of the lack of state funding. So there just tends to be this exponential impact then if you lose both things, or if you are historically underfunded and then lose these additional funds, then what you're losing in terms of actually in the school building just has an exponential impact on the students who need those resources most. And to the data piece, I think, actually, before I move to the data piece, I did see that there are a couple of questions in the chat about the impact of the new federal voucher program and district or states' options to opt into it. I mean, that is another whole topic, and one that actually, we invite folks next Monday. Pure Illinois is going to be hosting a panel on that very issue with some other out-of-state advocates who are going to be sharing more perspectives on it. I think work is still being done to quantify dollar for dollar the impact of states' decisions to opt in. But I think that opening the aperture a little bit, especially on this point about the impact on districts of reduced federal contributions to education, this is the plan. This is the initiative that the current administration is advancing. They're not making any allusions to this, and we're nonpartisan in terms of how we approach this work. So that's definitely the perspective from which I'm speaking. But when you look at the goals of moving toward privatization, more competition-based models, things of this nature, that is what opting into an introductory, and I will call it introductory on purpose because I think it was negotiated to be of a certain level right now. But the more that we lose revenue into privatization programs such as this one, the higher the impacts then that tend to be downstream in all of these different ways. So wanted to make sure to address that. And on the data point, this is one of the reasons also driving Pure Illinois' decision to try and put more effort into making these data available in a way that is accessible and comprehensible to our school communities here in Illinois. We are lucky to some degree that in Illinois there are some structures. As I said, we're reliant on Illinois State Board of Education data to be able to run these calculations. But also it's incumbent upon us then as stakeholders to take this information, analyze it, and be able to discuss it in ways that really help us to demystify it, because that's part of the structural constraints that are put in place as well, and that sometimes limit advocacy, is because sometimes systems hold this information in a manner in which they are inaccessible to the folks who are most impacted from them. So really preserving and democratizing this information is part of what is also behind this kind of data tool.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Danielle, do you want to also speak a little bit to these questions about how the new federal school voucher program will affect school funding equity if Illinois opts in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trend that we see across the country is generally that states that embark on these voucher programs tend to reduce their effort towards funding public schools. So even if the money is not, directly coming out of school district budgets, it does lend itself to disinvestment in the public system, and that's something to be worried about. I think perhaps a misconception about the federal voucher program is that it's not going to have that impact because this revenue is not coming from the state. But for any state that funds its schools based on enrollment, if you see an exodus of students into the private system, it's going to affect funding levels. And also just, generally there is no such thing as free money. Like it's still tax money, tax revenue that could have been going to other places. And, at the current estimates of, the billions of dollars that potentially could be siphoned off of the federal tax collections to fund this private school voucher program, could be, monumental. It does, if you're spending it one way, it means that you're not spending it another. And so we should all be concerned about that, I think.
Yeah. We're nearing the end of our time. There's also another comment in here I'll get to in a second. I'd love for both of you just to talk about or imagine, like, are there other ways of thinking about, or do you have other models of funding schools? I mean, when having a conversation like this, I always think of, there's this quote from John Dewey, I don't remember all of it, it ends with, what does it mean to have a commitment to everyone? And I think many people do not understand how inequitable our school funding models are. And so I'm just interested in whether or not are there other ways of doing this that you have seen work better in other places? Are there ways that we should be reimagining this in this moment? When everything is already so stressful.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for posing that question, Amanda. And that's right. Sometimes we get constrained by the pressures and stresses of the moment and get put into reactive postures, especially, as we've faced all of the threats and harms of the last year or so. And I think it's really important that we remain in dialogue and think prospectively about what is it that communities are looking for from their public schools. That's one of the reasons that we consider these dialogues. We do a lot of public school funding trainings with school communities across the state of Illinois, and always consider those to be multi-directional conversations, because the thing that we haven't included here today is really data on students' lived experience, right? That is its own form of valid data that we haven't captured in the conversation yet today, but that needs to be a critical piece of what informs us about what should we be aiming for creating. Because even as we talk about this, I often say, to take us back to the beginning, we're talking about what would adequate funding be. We're not talking about excellence. We're not talking about those big dreams that I think all of us have individually for ourselves and for our students. So it's a valid question. I don't have the answer to yet, but welcome the invitation to continue to be in dialogue about that.
Wonderful. Thanks. Danielle, get the last word.
Sure. So, I think that one of the things that I often think about is, the degree to which our policies create such segregated systems, and by design, those segregated systems are more expensive. And so the fact that we have, housing policy and economic policy that further that segregation and make it worse, then all lands on schools as they try to do the best with what they're given. So it's always a very difficult political conversation, but I think, if we can tie together attempts at desegregating our schools, both economically and racially, it would create better opportunities, less disparities between districts, and having those really tough conversations about, essentially resource hoarding, property values that drive, enormous amounts of dollars to some schools while others get nothing. And so why shouldn't we have a shared commitment to schools, public schools in our state that doesn't allow for that kind of disparity?
Absolutely. Okay, we have 1 minute. So Beatrice, do you want to, there's a question, I don't know if I guess you're seeing the Q&A. There's a question about, there's a group taking students from CPS down to Springfield this month to advocate for EBF. Do you have any suggestions for what kinds of stories they should share during these short meeting with legislators? Speaking of lived experience. Yeah.
That's right. Those legislator walk-in talks are critical. And I think that, the most important thing is for students to be able to authentically share their lived experience, tell their legislators what it is that they do like and benefit from in their schools and what they need more of. These young people are the most authentic reporters, I think, that we have of what is happening in our public schools. So really owning their individual stories and preparing them, it won't be a long period of time that you usually have with your legislator. So thinking in 1 or 2 sentences about what you like to share about what it is that you would like to see more of in your public schools and what you need that is missing, I think can be really impactful.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody for joining us here today. I can't emphasize enough how important this conversation is. We are so grateful to both of our speakers today and to the important organizations that they work for that are really leading these conversations both nationally and Illinois. We encourage you to use all of the links in the chat to find out more. And please do follow up with any of us if you'd like to be in conversation. So thanks everybody and have a wonderful day.